You're standing in the royal chambers. The air is thick with incense, but beneath it's something else, something rotting. The king lies on silk sheets that were white this morning, now stained with fluids no servant wants to name. His breathing comes in shallow gasps. His face, once the face of a conqueror, is gray. But it's what you can't see that tells the real story. Beneath the embroidered coverlet, beneath layers of bandages soaked through and changed hourly, his body has been waging a war against itself for 6 years. A war that began with a single moment of miscalculation, a lance tip finding flesh in the worst possible place, creating a wound that seemed to heal but never really did. And now, in this room that smells of frankincense and decay, you're watching the final hours of a man who united kingdoms, commanded armies, and bent rival rulers to his will destroyed, not by an enemy's sword, but by 2 inches of torn tissue that refused to forgive. Before we go deeper into this medical nightmare that toppled a throne, I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching this from? It's remarkable how a story of suffering from medieval Spain can reach someone halfway across the world. Centuries later, connecting us through the uncomfortable truth of how fragile power really is. The year was 1072, and Alfonso VI of León had just done the impossible. He'd reunited the fractured Christian kingdoms of northern Spain, Leon, and Castile under one crown. Something political observers thought would take a generation of bloodshed or never happen at all. He was 40 years old, which in medieval terms meant he'd already outlived most of his subjects. But more importantly, he'd outlived his rivals. The Muslim Tifas to the south paid him tribute. The nobles who'd once schemed against him now kept their schemes to themselves. He wasn't just a king. He was the architect of Christian Spain's future, the man who would push the Reconquista forward. The warrior diplomat who'd figured out how to be feared and respected simultaneously. And he loved tournaments. Not as a spectator sport, but as a participant. For Alfonso, these weren't just entertainments, they were political theater where he could demonstrate that his authority came not from abstract lineage, but from tangible skill. He could outride, outfight, and outlast men half his age. The tournament grounds were where he reminded everyone why they followed him. The tournament of 1072 was meant to be spectacular. Foreign dignitaries, ambitious nobles. Crowds that stretched beyond the wooden barriers. Alfonso rode onto the field in armor that caught the Spanish sun like a mirror. His lance balanced with the casual precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. His opponent's name has been lost to history and irony, considering what happened next. The charge, the collision, the angle that shifted just 1 degree at the moment of impact. The lance tip that found the gap in Alfonso's armor at the inner thigh, penetrating deep into the groin. He didn't fall. That's what everyone remembered later when they were trying to make sense of what came after. The king took a lance to the groin and didn't even fall from his horse. He completed the bout. He dismounted with his composure intact. The wound was perhaps 2 inches long, bleeding modestly. His physicians cleaned it with wine, applied a poultice of herbs, assured him it was nothing another scar to add to a warrior's collection. By evening, he was attending the victory banquet, accepting congratulations, feeling vindicated. Within a week, the surface had completely healed. A thin red line, nothing more. But here's what no one could see. What medieval medicine had no framework to understand. The lance had destroyed infrastructure deep beneath that healing skin. The human groin is an anatomical nightmare of complexity reproductive organs. Yes, but also crucial networks of blood vessels and lymphatic vessels that drain fluid away from the genital area. When those lymphatic vessels are severed, fluid begins pooling. The area swells, and in the warm, moist environment of the groin, any bacteria carried into the wound on that lance tip finds paradise. Alfonso didn't know any of this. Medical theory in 1072 still operated on the ancient Greek concept of humors that illness came from imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea of bacteria wouldn't exist for another 800 years. The understanding of lymphatic systems was non-existent. All Alfonso knew was that the wound had healed and life continued. 2 months later, he woke with a sensation he'd never experienced before, a heaviness in his scrotum, as if gravity had suddenly doubled its pull. By midday, there was visible swelling. By evening, his scrotum had enlarged to twice its normal size. It wasn't quite pain, yet was pressure, intense and relentless, that made walking awkward and sitting nearly impossible. His physicians examined him with growing concern. Excess phlegm, they concluded, cold wet phlegm accumulating in the genital region. The treatment was obvious: dry it out. Cold compresses, herbal remedies. Rest in darkness. For several days, the swelling subsided. The physicians declared victory. Alfonso wanted to believe them. 3 weeks later, it returned faster this time, more severe, accompanied by genuine pain that made him nauseated. And this became the rhythm that would define the rest of Alfonso's life. The dread of recognizing that first sensation of heaviness, knowing what was coming, and being powerless to stop it. The swelling beginning, always unstoppable. The color shifting from normal to reddish purple as blood vessels engorged. The surface temperature rising. And the pain that Alfonso described in whispered conversations with his most trusted physicians, as feeling like his groin was being crushed in an invisible vice while simultaneously burning from the inside. Walking required a specific gait now, legs spread wide. Careful, deliberate steps, each movement sending jolts through his entire body. Sitting was impossible. Lying down provided no relief because the weight of the swelling pulled constantly. Standing was marginally tolerable, but exhaustion brought its own agony. His physicians tried everything their tradition offered: ice compresses, bloodletting, leeches, dietary restrictions, prayers, religious relics, ointments that promised miracles and delivered nothing. But here's what was actually happening inside Alfonso's body. The biological catastrophe his physicians had no language to describe. The damaged lymphatic vessels couldn't drain fluid anymore. It accumulated, creating massive pressure. The bacteria from the original wound had established a chronic infection. Deep in the tissue, his immune system attacked it constantly, but could never fully eliminate it. Each immune response created more inflammation, more swelling, more tissue damage. The area would swell until the pressure became unbearable. His body would partially compensate. The swelling would reduce slightly. And then the cycle would begin again. Each cycle left him more damaged than before. During the worst episodes, which could last a week or more, Alfonso was essentially immobilized. He conducted the business of ruling from his bedchamber, servants bringing cold compresses every hour, his posture always slightly bent, always protecting his groin from invisible threats. Ambassadors who gained audience during these periods saw a king whose face was gray with barely controlled suffering, whose hands trembled, whose voice was tight with pain. Council meetings were cut short. Military decisions were delayed. A campaign that should have been launched was postponed, then postponed again, then canceled entirely when Alfonso became physically incapable of mounting a horse. Medieval kingship was intensely personal. A king's authority derived from his physical presence, his visible power, his ability to lead armies and dispense justice and host feasts. When Alfonso began missing important occasions, when he stopped appearing at tournaments, when he could no longer ride to greet victorious armies, something fundamental shifted in how his nobles perceived his authority. Ambitious men who'd been restrained by Alfonso's strong hand began testing boundaries, ignoring royal summons, delaying taxes, settling disputes with private armies rather than bringing them before the king's court. Alfonso's Muslim adversaries, who maintained sophisticated intelligence networks, learned quickly that something was profoundly wrong with the Christian king. The Almoravids, the North African dynasty that had recently arrived to reinforce Muslim Spain, saw opportunity. They began planning more aggressive campaigns, confident that Christian response would be disorganized and delayed. Within 2 years of Alfonso's injury, the military balance he'd constructed through decades of warfare and diplomacy began collapsing. Christian territories stopped paying tribute. Muslim cities that had feared his armies grew bolder. The frontier erupted into constant skirmishing. Alfonso watched helplessly as his life's work unraveled, his ability to respond limited by a body that betrayed him more with each passing month. By the 3rd year, the episodes were occurring every 3 to 4 weeks. His scrotum now swelled to the size of a small melon during peak episodes. The skin stretched so tight it became translucent, revealing a grotesque map of engorged veins beneath. The weight was extraordinary when he attempted to walk. Alfonso had to support the mass with his hands. Holding his swollen genitals like a burden he was forced to carry. His physicians, desperate and intellectually bankrupt in the face of a condition that didn't fit their theoretical framework, began proposing increasingly radical interventions. Small incisions to drain the fluid. Rejected when Alfonso was warned it could introduce more infection, cauterizing the area with hot irons. The suggestion horrified everyone present. Perhaps the problem was rooted in his soul rather than his body. More extreme penance, more donations to churches, more public contrition. By the 4th year, there were barely any good days, any more just periods of slightly less suffering between acute episodes. Alfonso's scrotum never fully returned to normal size. The skin had become permanently stretched and discolored, marked with purple streaks where blood vessels had ruptured and never healed. The chronic stretching had damaged nerves, creating odd sensations, numbness mixed with hypersensitivity, phantom pains that struck without warning. Alfonso described feeling like insects were crawling under his skin. These sensations made sleep nearly impossible, striking in the middle of the night, forcing him to sit up or pace. Trying to relieve torments that existed only in traumatized nerve pathways. Then came the fevers. During one particularly severe episode in the 3rd year, Alfonso developed a fever that lasted 3 days, a sign that infection had spread into his bloodstream. In modern medical terminology, Alfonso was experiencing sepsis, a life-threatening cascade where the body's response to infection causes widespread inflammation and organ damage. Medieval medicine had no concept of blood infection. They could only treat symptoms: cold baths to reduce fever, herbs to strengthen constitution. Alfonso survived, but barely. For several days he drifted in and out of delirium, calling out orders to armies that didn't exist, speaking to people long dead. The fever episodes became another recurring nightmare, happening during roughly half of the swelling episodes. The pattern was always the same. Swelling would reach its peak. Then Alfonso's temperature would spike dramatically, accompanied by shaking chills so violent that even heavy blankets couldn't stop them. During the worst fevers, he became delirious, speaking nonsense, failing to recognize people around him. His physicians feared each time that he wouldn't survive, that the infection would overwhelm him completely. The kingdom adapted to its king's incapacity by essentially functioning without him. A small circle of trusted advisors took over day-to-day governance, making decisions in Alfonso's name, issuing orders with his seal. This was necessary to prevent complete governmental collapse, but it created its own dangers. These intermediaries gained enormous power. Some enriched themselves, others pursued personal vendettas. There was no effective oversight because Alfonso, during his frequent incapacitations, couldn't monitor what was being done in his name. The kingdom began suffering from corruption at the highest levels. By the 5th year, Alfonso's body began showing signs of systemic failure. His kidneys, working overtime to process inflammation products, began to fail. His urine became dark and reduced in volume. His liver, stressed by years of heavy wine consumption used to manage pain, also began failing, causing his skin to take on a yellowish tinge. His heart, constantly elevated from pain and stress, began showing signs of strain, episodes of chest pain, shortness of breath. He was dying slowly, his major organs shutting down one by one from the cumulative effect of years of chronic illness. Yet even in this deteriorated state, Alfonso refused to formally abdicate or name a clear successor. He clung to power with desperate determination, perhaps because ruling was the only identity he had left. His legitimate heir, his daughter Urraca, was strong-willed and capable, but faced the enormous disadvantage of being female in an era when female rulers were viewed with deep suspicion. The succession question hung over the kingdom like a storm cloud. And this uncertainty further destabilized the realm as various factions began positioning themselves for the power struggle that would inevitably follow his death. The final episode began in the spring of the sixth year, a sunny morning that gave no hint of the horror about to unfold. Alfonso had been relatively stable for the previous week, and had even managed to conduct a full day of audiences. When the heaviness began, he tried to ignore it, hoping it would pass. But within hours, the swelling had started with unusual rapidity. By noon, his scrotum had reached proportions that normally took a full day to achieve. By evening, it had surpassed any previous episode, shocking even the physicians who had seen him at his worst. Alfonso's suffering was excruciating and unrelenting. Confined to his bed, he endured swelling that worsened overnight, his scrotum expanding to grotesque proportions. The skin stretched thin, darkening from red to a blue-black that signaled failing blood flow. Tiny splits leaked clear fluid as the tissue reached its breaking point. Fever surged through him, leaving him barely conscious, while his physicians watched helplessly. By dawn, his condition had collapsed entirely. A horrific tearing sound marked the moment the overstretched skin ruptured along several lines. Fluid, blood, and foul-smelling infected material spilled out in torrents, overwhelming everyone in the room. Attempts to stop the bleeding failed as the dying tissue could not hold pressure or stitching. Alfonso's body spiraled into shock, his pulse weakening as he slipped toward death. His final moments were brief flashes of awareness before his breathing ceased. His death unleashed immediate political turmoil. With no uncontested heir, rival factions rose quickly. His daughter Urraca claimed the throne, but met fierce resistance from nobles and illegitimate sons who demanded power themselves. The once unified kingdom fractured as competing rulers emerged, each backed by armed supporters. External enemies recognized the chaos as an opportunity, and the Almoravids launched decisive invasions. Much of what Alfonso had secured in life unraveled within months. Modern medical understanding suggests Alfonso suffered from severe lymphedema caused by lymphatic damage from a battlefield injury. This allowed chronic bacterial infection, likely from common pathogens such as Staphylococcus or Streptococcus, to persist and flare repeatedly. Over years, inflammation, swelling, and tissue degradation weakened the scrotal skin beyond repair. The final rupture triggered catastrophic blood loss, septic shock, and cardiovascular collapse. In a modern setting, antibiotics and early surgical intervention would have prevented nearly all of it. Medieval physicians, limited by the humoral theory, had no knowledge of bacteria or lymphatic systems. Their treatments, though earnest, could not address the underlying causes. This was not the failure of individuals, but of an entire medical worldview, unable to explain what was happening. Official accounts suppressed the gruesome details, reporting only a fever and short illness. But stories spread through servants and travelers, evolving into legends that framed his death as divine punishment or tragic fate. What remains, stripped of myth, is a stark reminder of fragility. A single unlucky injury altered the history of Iberia, reshaped political boundaries, and toppled a king who had unified kingdoms and achieved military triumphs. Alfonso spent 6 years watching his body betray him, his authority diminish, and his achievements unravel. His end was not heroic or symbolic only, the result of untreated infection and damaged tissue. In a forgotten grave lie the remains of a king undone by a wound that today would be minor, yet in his time carried the weight to change the fate of nations.